the very end of a summer that was all too short, the old man I was living with passed away. Even after all the years we spent together, I never knew his name. Later that evening, I dug a shallow grave in the front yard of our home and buried him there. At that moment, I was truly alone in the world.
If I were to sum up Fragile Dreams, then I would have to say it's unique, it's special, it's unlike anything I've ever played before. However, for these reasons, I always have a hard time explaining to other people what about this game makes it stand out. After all, Fragile Dreams is not perfect, and I don't think it's a game most people will enjoy either. It's a hard to recommend game except for that very specific group of people, such as myself, who cherish and revisit it every so often because there's just nothing else that compares to it. Every now and then, we all come across something like this, a piece that's so hidden away from the public eye that discovering it is like unearthing an age-old treasure. It's a hidden gem, a diamond in the rough. That's what can accurately describe Fragile Dreams to me. Because this is a game so obscure and unique, so potentially moving yet so flawed and imperfect. Perhaps that's why games like these remain hidden. Not all have the willingness to seek them out or the patience to come to terms with them. Yet, I find myself now in a position where I must tell you how much I love, how much I adore this humble, flawed gem of a game. Fragile Dreams is a sad and lonely game of involving themes and beautiful expression. It is a game that can be a tedious chore to play, but it disguises a heavy and valuable passion for video games as a whole. This is a game that will bring in broken expectations of a project that was just not supposed to work, but still comes out feeling so meaningful and strong. It's put together in such a fragile way, yet it's so enveloping with its highly specific merits. Though it can break apart easily, sensible hands can hold it closely and find that it's truly a beaconing beauty. But how can I convince you to play this game? Is it possible to be completely honest about the admittedly rough experience while also conveying the utter joy that it brings me? Can Fragile Dreams hide a fundamentally broken game through its own merits? Does the game successfully speak for itself to a player that is willing to listen? I believe it can. Though there are merits hidden away by layers of muck, I can still tell you how much value they hold. If you simply accept and believe my words so far, then I recommend you to stop watching this video right now. One of the best ways to experience Fragile Dreams is to go at it with a completely blank and open mind, untainted by expectation or the knowledge of what the game is all about, or what directions it might go into. Discovering this game on your own is a matter that requires patience, but it also feels like you've uncovered a unique and unheard of experience. I mean, but if you're still not convinced, then please, let me tell you of Fragile Dreams, the hidden gem of the Nintendo Wii. It almost feels like there are two different Fragile Dreams. One of them is a tedious and boring blunder mix of a plethora of genres like action-adventure, role-playing, or even survival horror. Uncertain how to make any of them satisfying, he just throws them together and expects them to work just how they are, producing some of the most mind-numbing gameplay on the Wii. Yet, on another hand, we have the poignant game experience I have been talking about, the one that is worthy of praise and understanding. This dichotomy is remarkable, as it can only lead one to wonder how it could even happen. How can something be so good and so bad at the same time? Indeed, the gameplay of Fragile Dreams is a near absolute failure when it comes to execution. Most of what it attempts to do in terms of interactivity, if there's anything it's trying to do, falls flat. An interesting and padded game design makes this side of Fragile Dreams quite an honest mess. There's no better place to begin than the game's controls. As a Wii exclusive, Fragile Dreams feels the need to utilize the Wiimote's pointer as a basis for its gameplay, and there's good reason for that. This was envisioned as an exploratory title, where the main character has to rely on his flashlight to reveal dark spots and hidden enemies. However, the execution of these controls is less than elegant, defeating the concept of using them entirely and forcing the player to ignore them as much as possible. Let me give you an idea. The game uses a mix of tank controls and third-person controls. You use the Wiimote to control the direction the camera is pointing at while also making the player turn at the same time. The controls lean very heavily on the tank control side because of this, meaning that the player must stop and reorient themselves every time they want to make a turn or circle around an object, which happens quite often, mind you. If the game didn't rely so heavily on pointer controls for camera and movement, like other tank control games that only use the D-pad or analog stick, this wouldn't be quite so confusing. However, Fragile Dreams also controls movement with the analog stick. But this movement is not relative to the player like in other third-person games, it's relative to the camera. What this means is that anytime the player turns their stick left, they're turning left in relation to the camera, rather than actually moving left. This movement is exceedingly difficult to get used to, and becomes even more cumbersome when you consider that moving ever so slightly to the back or to the sides of the character will slow the player down to a crawl. This odd mix of two clashing control styles, third-person and tank controls, is exceedingly difficult to get used to and doesn't have great results, especially in the middle of combat. However, this would be a much bigger problem if the game didn't default to a traditional analog control scheme if the pointer is turned off, making this kind of a non-issue. If nothing else, this oversight highlights how pointless and flawed the use of motion controls is for this game. Though it can be really immersive to get a feeling that you're holding the flashlight and using it to light up objects in the way of a dark corridor, the process of getting used to how the player controls is so nagging that it begs the player to turn off the feature entirely, until certain gameplay actions inevitably force you to use them again. Concerns with the Wiimote aside, the player's moveset is incredibly simplistic and limiting. This is kind of an odd complaint, but hear me out. Most of the time you play the game, you're just going from one direction to the next. The movement animations are stiff and there's hardly anything else you can do while moving. You can't sprint to make it go quicker, and there aren't any obstacles in your way that require jumping or doing anything else but holding that direction for an extended period of time. Except for, of course, a few areas where you kinda have to crouch to get through. Maybe this isn't indicative of the game having poor controls per se, but more of a highlight of how dour the level design can get. But more on that later. In between long periods of holding a direction down for minutes on end, you get to experience the game's combat, which is by far the clunkiest the game is. Your only means of attacking is a single button combo that locks a player in a slow, winding animation, unable to move or cancel while performing it. This combo has no variation whatsoever, except for delivering slightly stronger attacks if a player presses the buttons with precise timing. And there's no incentive for you to get more engaged with it as the game goes on. It's a lot like a survival horror game, but unlike other survival horror games, enemy encounters aren't threatening in the slightest. As a result of these oversights, combat is no more than a boring and ever so slightly frustrating button masher that doesn't satisfy in any way. The only deviation the player can get from the monotony of combat is varying their approach to each enemy with different weapons. But all of which carry the same problems and simplistic animation work. But at the very least they attack in different ways. Without the ability to dodge or block and combined with the tankiest controls, the player is basically vulnerable to tank a lot of hits from the enemy unless they awkwardly try to swerve away from the attack. All this means is that fighting enemies doesn't get good and doesn't get tense. It's just a battle of attrition until someone's hit points go down to 0. So, the combat isn't fun and the controls aren't great, but is exploring the environments at the very least satisfying? Well, this is what I wanted to talk about earlier. Usually, areas in the game are designed to be played in a strictly linear fashion, offering alternate paths only when the game expects you to go through them to find an item that's necessary to continue walking down the same linear path. The only variation in this linear path is basic backtracking that forces you to go back to previous areas that you've already explored completely, leading to tedious repetition of environments. While other survival horror games have complex layouts, acute puzzle solving, and dense explorable environments that keep you interested, Fragile Dreams has none of that. It really is as basic as you can get with the genre. What the game does, however, is mix and match genres however it pleases, without ever really finding a strict guideline to follow for anything it wants to do. Fragile Dreams is designed as a hybrid between survival horror and action and role-playing, for the most part. As we discussed previously, it doesn't offer the challenge or tension of a proper survival horror game because it lacks any challenge or investment in its level design. The elements of survival in this survival horror game are overly simplistic systems that can be easily bypassed or shifted aside. The main survival mechanic, weapon breakability, could add to the engagement of gameplay by increasing tension thanks to the fragility of your main method of attack, encouraging you to play the game wisely and use weapons only when needed. However, this is hardly the case, as it leads to one of two things happening. Either the player ignores combat altogether due to the marginal benefits of defeating enemies like experience, items, or money, which only serve the purpose of encouraging more combat encounters which you're already trying to avoid. Or the player stocks up on weapons while plowing through every enemy to obtain more items and experience, which is way more tedious than it sounds because the game is already so numbingly easy and frustratingly clunky to play. The other main mechanic that limits the player's survival is the grid inventory, which offers only a limited number of slots that can be filled up by items. This system is more of a mild inconvenience than an actual hurdle for survival, as the player will find save points way too often to manage inventory and get rid of the things they don't need. Since these save points also heal the player, they won't be needing to stock up on healing items either. Even when these checkpoints become scarce, the player can still easily manage their inventory by carrying only what they absolutely need and avoiding combat altogether if they ever run out of items. Now, survival is one thing, but when it comes to the game's RPG elements, there is sadly not much you get invested on either. The role-playing aspects of Fragile Dreams are just shallow window dressing. You have an experience bar, it grows every time you defeat enemies, you get higher HP every time you level up, and that's it. Ignoring how this character progression may or may not defeat the point of making the game survival horror by empowering the player through combat, the game lacks satisfying or investing mechanics to make it work as an ARPG anyway. As it stands, the player won't ever need to pay attention to the rate at which they level up. Not just because the game has no way of checking other than obsessively looking at the status screen, but also because the benefits are just marginal. It doesn't give you any new tools to play with or new ways to switch up gameplay. It's just thoughtless. Any good action RPG needs good enemies, and with Fragile Dreams, the enemies are alright from their visual design alone. However, their attack patterns are very predictable and easy to avoid, even considering the game's lack of a dodge or block move. This was probably done to mitigate the game's cumbersome controls, since you're supposed to fight enemies by pointing at them with your flashlight, causing them to appear before you. Yet, this mechanic is completely negligible in the long run, considering the player always has their flashlight on, and you can highlight enemies by just facing their direction. You don't even have to use the pointer. Trying to play the game as intended only makes combat worse, since you're locked in a struggle between fighting the enemy and fighting with the controls. That's not to say the gameplay is fair. It may be easy to beat, but at the same time, enemies don't play nicely either. Often, you will be forced to take a hit due to being locked into your attack animation, unable to cancel it in time to walk away from an incoming attack from either the same enemy or another enemy entirely. What's so frustrating about this is that enemies can often be flung backwards by your combo as well, making them disappear and appear elsewhere, oftentimes right in your backside, ready to serve another hit. This becomes increasingly frustrating because every time you're forced to take a hit, there's nothing you can do about it. These mechanics and attack patterns don't make the game more challenging. They just make it a whole lot more annoying to play. All this does is further extend the amount of time, padded time, that you have to spend dealing with combat encounters, and that's just not fun. But let's go back to exploration for one moment. And to give credit where credit's due, the game does give you a very solid first impression. Environments are lush and full of small and meaningful details that you can discover, which is particularly impressive for the Nintendo Wii. You are set free to frolic in the game's world, taking your time with each environment, appreciating the beautiful visuals, and uncovering all the hidden little details like drawings or hidden messages or story items. Even at this stage though, the game's lack of truly meaningful things to do persists. Any alternate pathways you might find lead to a dead end with no items, puzzles, or storytelling to find. So after some time you will just stop trying to explore as much and simply move on thanks to the accumulation of poor combat, unrewarded exploration, and cumbersome controls. This isn't even the worst of it. During the second half of the game, the level design only gets progressively worse. Though the game becomes more challenging by this point, you can feel how the developers ran out of steam and decided to make every level a linear slug of corridors and hallways, with bland and boring industrial designs, a harsh contrast against the more poetic and lush natural environments of the first half. And thanks to all this, the pacing of the game takes a massive hit, if it wasn't already slow and dull. But I know what you're thinking. The game sounds bad, it's something foul. It's a tiresome waste of time. However, that's not at all how I would describe the fragile dreams that I personally experienced. Though I did encounter these many issues and they were frustrating, there is more to the game than what I perceive to be its many failures. This continues to beg the question of why is Fragile Dreams such a captivating experience? Is it truly possible for the game to overcome all of its self-imposed troubles and failures to come out on top? Well, in truth, the answer is neither direct nor is it simple. When a game is so divided against itself, it's always up to the individual to decide what to take from it and what is more important about it. When an individual decides the merit of a work, subjective judgment is in play for the entire process, and in the case of Fragile Dreams, it is not a game that everyone or even many will enjoy. However, the game has to please somebody, and that somebody is a very specific group of people, including myself, with a keen eye for the storytelling and aesthetic of this game. To understand why I like Fragile Dreams, you must look at the core of its design to see what about it makes it so touching. Now, I'm going to try to explain why Fragile Dreams, despite all its problems, was such a special game to me and many others, and try to convince you to try it out on your own terms. It's important for me to do this because nothing else quite resembles the kind of dreamlike, mysterious, moving, and beautiful essence of Fragile Dreams. The game is an experience, a vacuum that drags you and pits you into its own world that hides so much yet shows you all you wanted to see. It is a game that constantly gives you something to discover, something to think about, and something to get emotionally invested on. This is particularly true for the game's gorgeous art direction. Using moon and the stars as a basic motif for its aesthetics, the game takes place mostly at nighttime, highlighting the beauty of nature, light, and darkness. Its usage of deep blues, blacks, and shining lights give the game an almost somnolent look, which is beautiful to stare at. The game's sparse use of color and its high contrast with the difference between pitch black objects in negative space and highly colorful environments give it an artistic and picturesque look that is completely captivating, especially during scenes that expand this basic palette and present the player with miraculous visual spectacles. When it comes to architecture, Fragile Dreams introduces you to highly detailed human-built environments that are run down and dilapidated. The abandonment of these areas is oozing with an awfully specific kind of desolate and reflective tone, showing things that are familiar through a perspective that is unfamiliar, contributing to the game's surreal feeling. By making the player think about the fragility of our civilization through its destruction and abandonment, the game can show you how beautiful the world can still be, even after it's been broken down and brought to its end, contributing to the core themes of isolation and demise we'll see right along in the story. The game also paces its environments really well. While the player is often going to explore majorly creepy, dark indoor areas for extended periods of time, the game will add some variety as a reward for continuing the game. After working through the constant, abandoned, and claustrophobic hallways of commercial buildings or underground passageways, the player is rewarded with and motivated by the beautiful scenery of dawn, morning, or dusk, which is so perfectly captured by its art direction, highlighting the beauty of even the simplest things. Fragile Dreams, Farewell Ruins of the Moon is pervaded by an awfully specific tone and atmosphere that not many other games come close to being familiar with, at least in the exact way that the game portrays it. When exploring each of the game's areas, The player must face the constant and oppressive forces of isolation and aggression from ghostly entities. This way, it is very easy to relate to Seto, the main character, since the player truly feels like the last remnant of a world that is now dominated by phantoms and the despair of regretful voices. Fragile Dreams writes a very careful line between being relentless and salvaging, sticking to a middle point that highlights the opposing viewpoints of carefully contrasted ideas. The crux of the game's tone is exemplified by its conflict between crushing and defeating nihilism and hopeful optimism, both of which are balanced by the grand scheme of the game's story. This very specific kind of drama that the game created inspires a player to keep going, keeping them enthralled by the narrative and the world of the game. This drama is portrayed in no better way than Rie Saito's beautiful and moving score, which perfectly complements and enhances this feeling. Her minimalist piano highlights the lonely nature of the quest as well as the beautiful simplicity of the barren world around you. She practices a great deal of restraint with the instrumentation for most of the game, leaving only the most important tracks to receive the special treatment of a more robust orchestra, highlighting the fleeting yet singular moments of happiness, sadness, danger, and comfort. The score does a fantastic job of layering different instruments to convey profound feelings which go hand in hand with the game's themes. Her design of the score and the beautiful melodies that it presents are delightful to say the least. The music of Fragile Dreams is an essential component in making every single beat of the narrative work as intended, forming a symbiotic relationship with the experience of playing the game and the experience of listening to the music of the game. Each song is so representative of the feelings that the game emanates, yet it's not capable of reaching any heights without it. It is truly an excellent summation of the game's components that helps it reach higher heights than it ever could. The game's atmosphere and story not only influence the emotions of the music, but the characters as well. Without knowing much of the characters that each track represents, you can still feel their emotions behind the tune, or even with the titles that the songs have. Any given theme is different and helps the player connect to their personalities much further by offering themes that can be sorrowful, ominous, simple, and even wonderful. Without such important compositions, the game would not have been able to become so resonant with its player base. More importantly though, is the game's sound design, which uses silence to highlight the mood. Each scene can only be so moving and meaningful when their carefully placed silence can give them a sense of minimalistic majesty and charm. Even among the scenes that have music, the player can consider their importance when contrasting the emotions of the melody to the stillness of silent exploration, forming a careful melodic harmony between the two moods. Only a world so lonely can be so silent, but only a world so silent can be so beautiful. The game's sound design is fantastic, especially thanks to the aforementioned use of silence and stillness. However, what is also important is the game's layering of atmospheric ambiance and muffled noise. The feeling of loneliness is only highlighted when the player has nothing but their own footsteps and the world's ambience to hear for a duration of time, and danger only makes itself present when something besides yourself begins to make a sound. Fragile Dreams shows many examples of this, a sense of minimalism and simplicity. It presents itself as simple, rudimentary, even humble, yet with all those things it can achieve so much because it has a point of comparison between the simple and the complex. Although simplicity is the heart of the game, the complexities it shows are what make it such an engaging and touching title. This isn't exemplified in any better way than the game's own story, one which is humane to a crushing degree, but alluring and moving as a result. And that's because Fragile Dreams is a sad game. Not a tragedy, as it doesn't focus on the very specific outcomes or events that become the crux of a larger drama. Instead, sadness is a general feeling that the game presents, acting as an overbearing cloud throughout the experience. Fragile Dreams is not a sad game because of the specific things that happen in it, but because of what everything in its story and artistic design contributes to. One of the ways the game contributes to this general feeling is by emphasizing the importance of the past and memory when telling its story. For instance, the player can find certain items in each area that you can use on a checkpoint to reveal the backstory hidden within them. These sub-stories tell many different tales with a distinct range of styles and character, yet they're all connected by the basic themes of memory, regret, and loss. These sub-stories help reinforce the themes of the game and tell of a larger story in its world, being well written on their own, but also adding additional hidden details that the player can piece together to gain a better understanding and appreciation of the many memories that this world holds. The story, lore, and world of the game is packed with so many details that the player won't even notice their first time around. So many elements or even small pieces of the story are interconnected, leading to larger realizations that are not explicitly told to the player, but grant them a more thorough understanding of the themes in question when fully taken into account. Fragile Dreams is a game full of mysteries, some of which are left unanswered, and some of which the player can find an answer to by looking at the small little things around them, making the story feel grander while retaining that sense of simplicity and heart. But going back to memory, the story is framed as a recounting of Seto's life experiences after he has already gone through the events of the game. This framing further expands the use of memory as a plot device to exemplify the fragile nature of the story. What the player sees, what they experience, is nothing more than a fleeting and minuscule moment in the life of this character. And through this specific framing, the player is reminded of the inevitability of the end, holding a shaky but also special connection to the events that happen. The past and memory is also important to the characters of the story as well, as they are shaped by the passage of time, longing for a past long gone. The character Crow hunts for an understanding of the past by regaining his memories. Sai is greatly affected by the things that happened to her during her life. The many ghosts the player fights are the embodiment of all the living regrets of people and the other souls that roam the earth, who must come to terms with the things they left behind in the past to be put to rest. Besides memory, the other major theme of Fragile Dreams is isolation, loneliness, and the longing of other people to share our lives with. The game deals with the lives of people who have only themselves to rely on and the inner conflicts that they embody. It explores the feeling of loneliness that they feel in a world where none but them remain, and their desire to share their life experiences with someone else to make the world they live in just a little more inhabitable. The interpersonal dialogues between these characters greatly portray their conflicted and lonely nature. Whenever they speak, they do so in a way that's attached, with long pauses, aloof reassurances, and awkward responses that show their inexperience with communicating with other people, but also their inner necessity and desire to connect. Characters are eager to become connected with one another, and to acknowledge the presence of someone else, even despite their incapability and inexperience, just for the sake of fulfilling that inner desire for connecting with someone else. Such a subtle display of dialogue and conversation makes each character much more inherently human and relatable to the player, as they can showcase a great amount of depth and feeling without outright stating it.
I just want to hold her hand, to see what I see, and respond to what I say. That's all I really want. Wandering around alone, looking up at the moon by myself, I'm sick of it!
Dialogue wouldn't be nearly as effective if not for the game's voice acting, where each individual actor understands their characters and brings the dialogue to life in the best way. Yanni Young Bosch's portrayal of Seto is at the forefront of the vocal performances, contributing to the great relatability of his character thanks to his strong performance. But this is not exclusive to Seto, however, since every character is portrayed by an actor that understands the flowing and endlessly complex emotions of the story, bringing the game's script to life in a concrete way. Voice acting is not the only way that the game expresses the plight of its characters. Through the game's tone, the player can more easily connect to and understand the issues that everyone, Seto in particular, are dealing with. When you experience that sense of loneliness, isolation, and hardship for yourself, you can hold Seto's conflicts much closer to heart, and truly strive for the same thing he's striving for. Not only joining him in his quest, but feeling motivated to feel like you're a part of it. The isolation of our characters only makes the current state of the world and their lives even more tragic and difficult. After all, Fragile Dreams' tone is delicately positioned between life and death, optimism and nihilism. By giving the characters oppressive anguish and then putting it away for scenes of relief and companionship, or by giving the characters hope and then taking it away when they need it the most, the game is as crushingly grounded as it could be, never keeping things idyllically optimal nor devastatingly hopeless. Its juxtaposition of closeness and distance between the characters makes isolation feel like a constant, no matter how close any of the characters may seem. It is because of this overbearing sense of loneliness that our characters seek each other out and become willing to get closest to each other, no matter how different their personalities and backgrounds may be. Thanks to this, the smallest and simplest relationships in the story can become some of the most meaningful ones. Even when their interactions are minimal, and even if these characters know little about each other, we understand their desire to be together and their desire to care for each other, since no one else cares for them in this lonely world. Their longing, their desire to enrich their lives by finding something they're missing, is another core concept in the story that is explored. Every character that we encounter is driven by a certain desire, one that they carry as a reason to continue living in a world that no longer lives. It is thanks to this sense of longing that the characters persist throughout their journey, even when their resolve is tested in the most tragic ways, and even when the end result of their efforts is uncertain and unclear. Another idea that the story explores is the inherent longing that humans have for communication and empathy. One of the biggest difficulties of society is coming to terms with our individual differences and our inability to fully understand others. That's why Fragile Dreams explores the lives of characters that have an inner, burning desire to be understood, but have trouble communicating and understanding other people due to the loneliness that the world has cursed them with, testing their resolve to overcome these barriers for the sake of themselves and their own happiness. This theme is given life through Seto, the main character of the story, and the driving force behind the chain of events that happen. Out of all things in the world, all Seto has ever wanted is to be with someone, no matter who it is and no matter how it happens. A lack of human contact had forever marked his life, only being able to perceive the phantoms left behind in the world and deprived of the warmth and presence of another human. Because of this, he accepts the company of anyone due to his strong desire for companionship, even if he doesn't expect much out of that person and even if he doesn't quite understand them. His dream to be with a silver-haired girl is shaped entirely by the singular desire of having a life-lasting companion, one that he can share his discoveries and experiences with to give his life a deeper meaning, even if their interactions aren't complex. Yet, his cause is flimsy, since everything around him is fated to one day disappear from his reach, much like his lifelong caretaker. Even if he is successful, he also has no assurance that the interactions he'll have will be positive, or that he'll be successful in becoming friends with her. But these are the hardships that make Seto want to try harder to make his dreams come true, since the alternative of remaining alone in the world for his entire life would be his greatest nightmare. Seto's lack of experience in communicating with people is what drives his desire to do it more often, even if it is aloof, because even the smallest interactions can make him feel like the world has something else to offer other than himself. The villains of the story represent an antithesis to his character, because instead of embracing their need for interaction, they reject it. The conflict of human empathy became too overbearing for them because their desire for longing was met only with rejection and hatred. His suffering led to the ultimate rejection of empathy and communication altogether, once he realized that humanity is incapable of communicating their true nature to one another. He decided that destroying human empathy altogether would also cut off humanity from its own sadness and conflict. If any flaw can be brought up with the story at all, then it's the hasty development of this conflict in the last act of the game. As interesting as all these ideas are, and as clearly as the game might present them, they are simply introduced very bluntly in the middle of a story that, up to this point, didn't have a conflict. This development then escalates too quickly to the point where it becomes a little overwhelming to the player, making it difficult for them to connect to the story's resolution. However, this doesn't distract from the complexity and raw nature of the story and themes. Through the game, the player is presented with the question of whether or not human empathy is truly possible, and whether people can successfully fulfill their inner desire for longing and interactions by communicating with other people. Seto challenges this question by overcoming his anxiety and insecurities due to his pressing need for companionship, even if it brings him suffering in the end, and even if his attempts may be futile. It is for this reason that the world disagreed with the ideals that Seto represents, accepting that human empathy was just too difficult to be possible, and opting for the easy way out to empathize and communicate with others, even if it led to the end of the world. Seto's perseverance makes him reject this flawed notion, because he also embraces the suffering that interaction, empathy, and communication brings, since his suffering also stems from the great happiness that talking to others and being with others gives him. And this is the beauty that Seto finds in such a dilapidated, broken world. He finds his happiness in people and in all the little things he can say and do to feel like he's not alone in this world. When the world lacks so much value and brings so much suffering, there is still something that can be found and something that can be created from it. Even if it is for a short and passing amount of time, the happiness it was able to bring far exceeds the inevitable nature of its departure. It is thanks to themes and messages like these that Fragile Dreams can be so captivating and touching. After all, Fragile Dreams is not a sad game, but a beautiful game instead. It is a moving game, a game that understands the attentive contrast between being detached and close, crushing and hopeful, as well as devastating, while also being heart-rendingly moving. Fragile Dreams is a game that understands the human spirit, taking inherently human ideas and conflicts and tackling them in a way that's uncommon, raw, and so true to the structure of a video game. It lets the player experience these ideas firsthand and allows them to come to their own conclusions about the experience, one that feels personal, that is unique, and that is unlike anything else, forming a game that is as beautifully charming as it is mysterious. And after spending so much time telling you why I love this game, I just cannot come to a conclusion of what it's like overall, what the general consensus is, because experience is just so beautifully subjective. No matter how hard I criticize the game and throw it against the wall for its many flaws and imperfections, I cannot ever hate this game. No matter how much I love it though, I still can't hide the many problems that it has. Fragile Dreams is a human game, filled with flaws and imperfections, but it's still up to you to decide how much you want to value what it offers. For this reason, I have only presented to you the reasons why I personally love this game and nothing else, leaving it up to you to decide whether you want to experience it on your own terms or not. If you decide to follow my advice and give it a shot, then I can promise you, you'll have an experience that can understand you, that will touch your heart, that will change you, that is deep and that is complex in all its minimalism and humble simplicity. I promise you that Fragile Dreams, Farewell Ruins of the Moon is a game that you will remember, if only you give it an honest and patient chance. So I speak to you now, directly, not as the impersonal writer of this review, but as the person who experienced all that this game has to offer. I ask you to give Fragile Dreams a chance, with patience and with willingness, and with an open heart. Because a gem that is so hidden cannot shine as bright if you don't cast a light against it. For all its merits, and for all its faults, Fragile Dreams is a gem that dug deeply into my heart. Hey, thank you for watching my video. I put a lot of work into this thing, and I'm glad you were able to sit down through the whole thing. At least, I assume you did, Now this is the part of the video where I ramble around in one take and tell you of other things you can click on. So first off, this was an adaptation of an old review I wrote on my personal website. You can find other written content of the same style there. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, then feel free to click the link in the description and read some of my other content while you're at it. I specialize in reviews, but also long-form analysis of various games like the Nier series, and I recently released an Undertale analysis too, which you can check out. You're also free to follow me on Twitter if you want to find me on social media and perhaps receive updates of when new content is coming up, or just want to hear my opinions on other things. There's also my Patreon page, which isn't too active these days sadly, but it's still the best way for you to support my content directly if you want to see more. If you're willing to donate, then you'll gain access to a few perks like being able to vote on polls, read special articles with extra thoughts on the various things I work on, early access to all my content, or even choosing what games I review. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say. Next video is probably gonna be a retrospective on Tsukihime, a visual novel from the 2000s I have a certain fascination towards. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Bye.